So, Anthony, I've just done the Australian Alpine walking track. Did it with a few mates. In fact, just got back last week. And I noticed some big changes happening up in the Kosciuszko National Park. You know, probably 80% of the trees we saw were burnt. And, the fires that you experienced have left a big mark on Kosciuszko National Park, putting it under a lot of stress. And the other thing that I really noticed was the number of brumbies around. You know, they really are the dominant animal in the high country. Now, and I wanted to talk to you about both those things, if that's all right. But well, look, firstly, tell me about 2019 when you did the Australian Alpine walking track, and particularly how it ended for you.
2019 was a transformational period, personally for me. And I think, for the world as well. I think in two ways, because we did have the Black Summer, which really, I think, for the first time, led a lot of people to join the dots between climate change and our own lives and dangers that we face that will be increasing. And of course, late 2019, I think it was New Year's Eve 2019, was when they found a new virus in a wet market in Wuhan, China. So. The world was in flux, and I with it. I'd been a journo in sort of news and sport for the best part of 20 years, and I was craving a change. And I guess a sports journalist is something that a lot of people think is a dream job for a bloke or for a woman. I don't mean to be sexist. A lot of sports lovers out there.
Yep.
And I was over it. I will never be the person who's buried in their 10 colours. I loved it, but I fell out of love with it. I'd always been an outdoorsman and a skier, and I'd never sort of really had the guts to put those two things to make them the forefront of what I actually write about. You know what I mean? Rather than just a hobby. So, that's setting a really broad canvas for your listeners to understand that I was a guy who was in transformation myself. And when I took off on the Australian Alps walking track in December...
And you did that on your own, didn't you? Which is a huge achievement.
Yeah, well, it's a big undertaking. I mean, you've done it. And in a sense, Matt, it's almost, I think, easier to do on your own. David Chapman, who writes the sort of guidebook to the track, which is different to my book, which is sort of an experiential book. Yep. Chapman says that you really don't want more than 4 in your party. And speaking to Chapman in person, I've met him since. I assume you travelled with Chapman's book, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. He reckons 2 is the right number because you can make a decision with 2. You might disagree, but there are ways to resolve things. As soon as you've got 3 or 4, should we do this? Should we do that? Is the weather coming in? Is it not? You've got a committee meeting. And these decisions on a major remote area hike like this raise their heads all the time. How many did you do it with?
We had varying numbers. We picked up a few people along the way. That we did the high part of the Kosciuszko from Kinder to Thredbo with 7 people actually.
Yeah, right.
But we knew that part of the track really well. Most
and there are a lot of huts. There are a lot of huts through most of that as well. So if weather or something else turns ugly, that you have quite a lot of sort of options for refuge, don't you?
You do, but gee whiz, you have to be careful when you get up high above the tree line because you're very vulnerable to weather. And we raced into Thredbo ahead of a huge blizzard, actually, with 20 centimetres of fresh snow.
Yeah,
and those kind of conditions can be pretty dangerous when you're up high. So I think you got to be on your toes.
You do, but I mean, look, this is all setting the broad canvas. I did undertake this by myself. Look, I wanted my peace of mind. My kids are at an age where I could bugger off for 5 weeks. They're sort of deep into teenagehood, so they're sort of not requiring me to drive them around of weekends and things like that. I've waited several years for the right window for this.
Yeah.
And I've been a digital journalist for many years. I've run websites for people. My latest job, I was running Channel 10's, helping run Channel 10's website. And then I was writing one of their TV shows, and then they said you might as well write and present it since your material, no one reads it better than you do yourself. So, you know, I was doing a TV show, writing a TV show, running a website. I was cramming about 11 days into 5 each week, and I was just burnt out. You know, I could have called my book From Snow to Ash Burnout, because that's what happened to the country in the end, and that's certainly what happened to me. And I think that was so. My motivation was to snap the cycle that I've been working with for many years. Get on the Australian Alps walking track. I had always been obsessed with the Australian Alps, and like most people, I'd go skiing in Thredbo, or I'd walk the same little bits around Kosciuszko or Perisher or somewhere like that.
Yep.
I'd done 1 and 2 and 3 day sort of probing walks slightly further into the park. I'd climbed Jagungal, one of the great peaks in the north.
Yep.
Climbed Bimbury, which is, you know, the highest peak in the ACT, which is a lot higher than people think, about 1,900 metres.
Yeah, just 300 metres lower than Cosy. It's amazing.
Yeah, and it's a great walk.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and so I've just done some sort of 2 or 3 day walks like that, Matt, just to penetrate a bit further into the park. But that's as much as I've done. And I wanted to see the boring bits as much as I wanted to see the spectacular bits. I wanted to feel the size and the scope of the Australian Alps. That's why I took off on the 5-week trip. And unlike you, I started at the southern end in Gippsland. But very much like you, I got a massive summer blizzard. You got a spring blizzard, but I got a huge. We got 60 centimetres of snow. 60
centimetres, yeah.
Up at Mount Hotham on the day I was dropping food, and we drove through the mountains doing 5 food drops, and you know it was only more like 10 or 20 or 30 on the ground at Mount Borbor in the south on day 2, but there was still summer snow walking, which was good fun. But it quickly melted and became the Black Summer. That was the last little gasp of an Antarctic cold front, and then the weather pattern of the Black Summer well and truly took over, and it was 35 degrees most days, you know, in the highlands, you know, which means it's 40 or 45 on the low country. It was a long, hot walk, and that's why I got off the track a couple of times. You know, I was absolutely, no matter, I had trained, I had walked with full pack on a 20k circuit in the Royal National Park outside Sydney where I live every weekend. I was hike fit, but there's hike fit and there's a tough track like the Australian Alps track in 35 degree weather with a lot of the creeks dry, you know. So it was a very tough summer to do it. But Matt, that's sort of the broad picture. I was burnt out in my life. I took off at that point. And, you know, your question to me was originally about the mountains themselves that are damaged, that are now a compromised landscape, about trees that are burnt in so many areas of Kosciuszko and beyond, about damage from brumbies and deer and other sort of species that weren't originally there. I guess we can morph onto that, if you like, because...
Well, tell me. You started to see some, you know, a lot of smoke fairly on in your walk, I think, and it just seemed to slowly get worse and worse. Is that right?
Yeah, more or less. Actually, the first 2 or 3 weeks were blissfully clear. Even though the weather was scorchingly hot, this was a fire season that sort of worked its way down the coast. There were Queensland fires in winter, in July and August. Yeah. There were fires in northern New South Wales in August into September, into October.
Yeah.
And, you know, the Kosciuszko fire crews, who normally have their quiet time at that time of year, were actually seconded up north to help out. So that's and then, you know, so by the time the fires reached Kosciuszko on New Year's Eve, I'm sort of jumping ahead of myself, like a bushfire jumping containment lines in my sort of thinking and speaking here. But it's just interesting to your listeners to know that by the time the fires hit Kosci around the turn of the new year and went on and on around Cooma and around the whole district for another 6 weeks, those guys were already exhausted. They were absolutely shattered already because they've been fighting fires since July. And that's the scale of our fire seasons now. You know that the fire season is better than anyone living in Tathra. You know, coming from up north was was how the fires travelled. But as I say, they weren't there till New Year's Eve in Kosciuszko. So the Victorian High Country, which had its earliest fires on record in October, there was a big fire around Mount Bogong. Then they had 2 blizzards. That helped extinguish those fires. Snow will do that. But they'd had their earliest fires on record, but as I say, the blizzards came. I walked in a really clear, majestic December for the first 3 weeks.
Nice.
Bor in southern Gippsland. Magnificent.
Yeah.
Bit of snow on the ground, cleared up, cool for 2 days. Then it was hot for 3 weeks through, the Mount Hotham area, the Bogong High Plains area, the low country around the Mitamita River, the Victorian border country. And it was only from that border country around Kawombat Flat, which is the source of the Murray River, and about 3 days walk south of Thredbo. It was only as I walked north to Thredbo that the skies started becoming very milky with smoky light. So smoke was drifting in from still quite far afield, at least a couple of 100 kilometres afield. There was an easterly one day, and it blew in from the coast because there were already coastal fires. So it was really only in the last week or so of my walk that I went, oh, geez, the Black Summer is closing in. I thought I'd sort of, the mountains would magically manage to skip the fires, but that didn't prove to be the case in the end. And again, that speaks to the changing fire regime that we have, because one of the people interviewed in my first book, From Snow to Ash, published in 2020, was Ian Dicker, the Chief Fires Operations Manager of Kosciuszko. And Dicker said they'd never seen a fire run the way that fire ran. It got to Kosciuszko from 100 kilometres within 24 hours. The big fire that got Kosciuszko was called the Duns Road Fire. Now, fires, as you no doubt know, are named after their place of origin. Duns Road is in goddamn Tarcutta. Tarcutta is famous for being the halfway town on the Hume Highway between Sydney and Melbourne. Now, anyone who knows the geography of southeastern New South Wales at all, as I'm sure most of your listeners do, knows that Tarcutta on the Hume Highway is a bloody long way from Kosciuszko National Park. I mean, it's not a bloody long way in the scheme of New South Wales or Australia, but you're sitting out there in Tarcutta, you're not thinking about Kosciuszko being over the hill, because it's not. Yeah. It's over several hills, several valleys, and it's a good hour and a half drive from there. And so for a fire to run from Tarcutta to Kosciuszko basically in a day is and there's so much damage on the way. Farmland, then forest, then farmland, then forest. This was unprecedented. So fires are running in a new way, and that's because the country had never been that dry. The temperatures had never been that warm over the scale of a summer. I should tell you, listeners, one of the things I'm doing now is writing weather for a living. I'm writing weather 2 days a week for a company called Weatherzone, and I'm writing climate for a new entity, environment and climate generally for a new entity called the Green Canary, which you'll be hearing more about in the new year, where the Black Summer did seem to be tightening its grip across a broader area of the country, and that Kosciuszko, it seemed now, would at some point be in the line of fire. But I was 3.5 weeks into a planned 5-week trek. I didn't know the fires were coming, knew that the summer was closing in, lost connection to the internet just because I was in a lowish section for about a good 24 hours or so. I had brief flickers here or there, but it was too frustrating. Couldn't charge my phone very well because I was relying on a solar panel, which is a stupid thing to do. Next time I'll just bring a charging brick. And the solar panel, the problem was the cloud generated by the bushfire. So it started to get worrying. I knew the fire was a lot closer than I thought it was. There was ash falling. I was looking at the leaves. You know, the first chapter is called Reading the Leaves, isn't it? Off From Snow to Ash. I was reading the leaves. I was trying to say, all right, charred leaves falling from the sky, where are you from? Because snow gum leaves have a particular grain. And even though the leaves are charred, you could still see the grain. and they have like a parallel grain, like Hart, just north of Mount Jungle, in northern Kosciuszko, in the sort of rolling plains country. And, you know, long story short, as we ascended, I saw the plume of smoke. It was about, I would estimate, only 6 or 7 kilometres away. Wow. And because that vast fire, which had run 100 k's pretty much overnight, had created the weather ahead of it, with its vast heat, it forms condensation, it forms thunderstorms. There was drizzle that day, and at the head of that sort of storm front was just some dull grey weather, which is what I'd been in, and it completely masked the terror and the horror that was behind it. It completely cloaked it. So I had no idea. I had no internet, and I was unable to read. That's my story. It's not that dramatic. Yeah, and then what happens is I'm sitting in the helicopter. All this has been computed in my brain. I've been working on this for 5 years to try to get the time, the fitness, and the gear, and just everything. It's instantly over. Everything I said about it not being binary is true, but I still wanted to do the last week. You know, I really wanted to do the last week, and I wasn't. You know, I would have spent the last day or two sort of thinking about it and preparing to walk off the trail. Suddenly I'm off the trail. I'm being chopped at the Jindabyne. All that's going through my head. And the journalist in me goes, you know what? Journalists are very mercenary people. We're terrible people. Like the worse a thing happens, the better a story we've got. Absolute terrible mindset to be in all the time. Just, what? How many died? Awesome. Measure the clicks on this. It's awful. You really shouldn't joke about it, but you know, those conversations do happen in newsrooms. Anyway, I was just thinking, well, you know, I started in a summer blizzard and I've ended in a summer blaze, and that's actually not the worst premise for a bit of an adventure story. I think blizzard to blaze sort of pitch that I made to them, and it was about me and my state of life and the stuff I mentioned earlier in this chat, about wanting to see the Alps and do them properly, and about wanting to snap the intense digital brain that have been ticking for 10 years and see what might happen if I just, you know, put a real roadblock there and what might happen afterwards. So it was about me, and it was about the track. I interviewed Chapman, the author of the guidebook, and I did a bit about the history of the track. I interviewed, you know, Klaus Huneker, who's in Canberra, the leading Huts historian, to talk about the history of the Huts. I interviewed historians, authors, fire experts, but I also interviewed ecologists about fire dynamics, and I interviewed forest experts and water experts and Brumby scientists who are experts in Brumby damage, and it became, I hope you agree, From Snow to Ash almost became a book about the mountains in peril, about an iconic Australian landscape, which to me is as iconic as the Great Barrier Reef, and to me is more interesting and beautiful. Sorry, coral freaks. But I'm just a mountain person. And it became about, you know, my walk through the mountains, my 700k walk or you know, significant chunk thereof, became the narrative spine on which I was able to hang all these other ideas. And it worked well. That's what I'm proud of what I've done. I used the narrative spine of the hike to hang a much bigger story upon, and that story is the mountains in peril. The mountains which we think of as these big, tough, hulking things, impervious to damage, are in fact burning too often for their delicate and unique ecology. The lack of the diminishing snow is more than an annoyance for skiers who hit rocks. It is an ecosystem-wide issue. Feral pests like deer and other invasive species like brumbies are a problem. There are a lot of problems, and that's all there. So you can sort of have it. I like to think of it as good medicine, or as good tasting medicine. You know, you can learn your ecological lessons, but you're not bored. You don't feel obliged to turn to the next page. You want to know where's this idiot hiker with his absolute rubbish internal monologue that might feature anything from what he had for lunch today to some idiot he talked to at work 4 years ago. You know, there's a lot of garbled brain waves sort of just thrown on the page. And I think each little element of the book serves its purpose, whether it's to keep you turning the next page to see what happened, or just to keep you guessing as to, you know, what the idiot narrator will talk about next, or to find out more about our imperiled mountain.
Well, I like you, after doing the Australian Alpine walking track, just fell in love with the mountains. It's just such a unique environment up there, and something that's worth fighting for to preserve. And it does face a challenge. You know, this show, my radio show, is about climate change, and you know, I'm really worried about Kosciuszko National Park as we get warmer. And you know, the warming hasn't even started yet. And look at the impact that we've had with the fires. When I walk through the national park, and 80% of the trees up there are dead. You know, there's a rapid transformation going on at the moment, which is.
Look, I think. Sorry, mate. You finish.
Go. Well, I think it's devastating what's happening up there at the moment. It is a world-class, pristine environment, and we need to do whatever we can to keep it that way, which is going to be more and more difficult as we get warmer.
It's a level above world class. It's Kosciuszko class, and that speaks for itself. I mean, it's the best landscape in the world. It's incredible. It's so majestic. I mean, the snow gum is one of the great creations, and or evolutions, you know, depending on who else. And look, here's the thing. Here's what some people may not understand. Even your listeners who are across a lot of these things. This country cannot burn as often as the low country. Now, any country can't burn too often. You can overburn any country. But they spoke of the Great Fire in the 20th century, and that was the 1939 fire. It was Alps-wide. It was still the only fire that went the entire Australian Alps. It burnt from what actually was still there in the ACT all the way to Gippsland. It burnt the entire length of the Australian Alps walking track and all the country around it. Yeah. But we've had a lot that have burnt much of it since then, like the 2003 fires that were hundreds of houses were destroyed in Canberra, and lives were lost. So the 1939 fires was the 20th century mega fire. We've had 4 mega fires in the Alps, classed as mega fires this century in 20 years. So we've gone from 1 in 100 to 4 in 20. Sounds like a pie. As it continues to warm, as we mentioned, what are we going to go from? 4 in 20? We're going to go to 1 mega fire every year. I mean, and the country can't handle it. The alpine ash, which are the glorious straight trees that grow above the mountain ash but just below the snow gum, and there's a lot of mountain ash. That's what you see, a lot of the dead trees. Anyone who's ever driven Thredbo, Gussega, a lot of the roads in the snowy mountains, from Adaminaby over to Kayanda, a lot of that is alpine ash country, and it's been decimated. If it burns twice in 20 years, it's gone. And a lot of the alpine ash went in 2003 because it needs 20 years to establish a seed bank properly in the soil. And tragically, the 2020 fires, where the Black Summer fires in the north of Kosciuszko got a lot of the 2003 alpine ash country that have been burnt. So, mate, long story short.
Look, the poor old alpine ash, beautiful stands of alpine ash, but they don't have that same epicormic growth that a lot of eucalypts do, and
that is correct.
So they need to grow from seedlings in 20 years before they start producing seed again. That's why a second fire within 20 years wipes them out.
That is it. That is explained perfectly by you. So it's a tragedy. I mean, there's a thing called Sawyer's Hill. From Adaminaby to Mount Selwyn, always at the greatest alpine ash. Always just you look at it in winter and go, oh, why am I going anywhere else? I should get out of the car, walk up the hill, and ski between these magnificent trees. But that's going to become what forest scientists are now calling a subalpine savanna now, in all likelihood. In all likelihood. It's even too early to say for sure, but in all likelihood. And a subalpine savanna is a pretty worthless, scrubby landscape that doesn't often offer shelter or food for marsupials, and it just doesn't offer much to anyone. So we are witnessing a transformation of a great Australian landscape at a pace much quicker than people realise. And, you know, it's a long, circuitous path to say Australia therefore has to drastically rather, do a train in the background there, drastically reduce its emissions so that everyone else can reduce their emissions so that the Earth can slowly cool again, ... But we have no other choice. We have no other choice than to follow that long, circuitous path, because nothing will save Kosciuszko that we can do. We can drop seeds from helicopters, incredibly expensive, and replenish some of those alpine ash forests. They have done that in Victoria. They have done that in places. Expensive, slow, does work though. But to do that Alps wide is just ridiculous. So climate change is just an urgently pressing issue up there, and that again is not even to mention the snow. But look, that was from snow to ash.
So Anthony, you've written, in addition to Snow to Ash, which is a fantastic lament for the snowy mountains, I suppose, and a beautiful book and a great insight into how majestic Snowy Mountains is. You've also just published the Brumby Wars, and here's an interesting fact, because as we started from the north end of the walk, you started at the south. So we walked from ACT National Park into New South Wales National Park, and as soon as you cross the border, there's a dramatic change, and that is that there's a pile of horse manure, which usually stands a couple of feet high, big pile of it, every 10 or 20 feet. And you immediately recognise that in the New South Wales, at Kosciuszko National Park, the dominant animal is the wild horse. In fact, we saw way more horses than kangaroos, and they're just everywhere. The top of the cobras, top of the pile, some of the most rugged country in Australia, and we're seeing piles of horse manure everywhere. You've written about this. It's a complex issue, and one that's going to need a solution, and that solution is going to cost money. It's a very contentious issue with people really strong opinions on both sides of the debate. So I'll look at the cover of your book, The Brumby Wars, and a magnificent photo of two wild beasts duking it out on the Kiandra high plains. What a magnificent creatures these are, really strong, powerful, wild animals running free. I can see how there's an enormous sentiment here for treating a beautiful animal humanely, but I can also see that they're doing enormous damage to the national park. What sort of problems are the wild horses causing in Kosciuszko, do you think?
Okay, it's not. I think it's. I know, and so do the scientists. The Brumbies are doing all sorts of damage, but the main problem is to the wetlands. The wetlands are the source of the Surrey, the Murray, the Murrumbidgee, Australia's great rivers. And the wetlands, as you know, are held together by a thing called sphagnum. Sphagnum is nature's miracle moss. It holds the water, it stores the water. If it doesn't rain for months, rain or snow, winter or summer, the tiniest creek as wide as your arm will still flow with beautiful clear water, because from the sphagnum, which holds that water, it trickles a tiny little bit of water, through the sponge-like sphagnum moss, and it holds the whole landscape together. The coral frog lays its eggs in the sphagnum, but the whole landscape is tied together by this, and the grasslands near it. And it's not just the sphagnum, but look, the heaviest sort of grazing animal in most of Kosciuszko before horses and cattle arrived last century, and they kicked them out because they saw the damage that they were done. But the heaviest grazing animal was an echidna or a copperhead snake. Especially up high, you get the kangaroos down low and the wombat.
Yeah.
You can't put a 500 kilo or a 250 kilo animal and expect it to do no damage. So the Brumbies are basically turning beautiful coloured swampland, because Fragrant's very colourful. It's a sort of pineapple-y, sort of yellow and green colour, almost fluorescent, with lots of little red plants that grow around it, and this majestic, colourful landscape into just brown, muddy, paddock-style, overgrazed paddock-style landscape. To turn the miracle of Kosciuszko, which is more like a Siberian tundra, it's a sixth of 1% of the Australian landmass is the high country. And in the very, very highest area of that sixth of 1% of the Australian landmass, you do have these plant communities that are like Siberia or the Canadian tundra or the high alpine above 3,000 metres in the European Alps. It's absolutely a miracle. And to turn that into a farm paddock is the worst thing I've seen ecologically in Australia. It's like an oil spill from a vast ocean tanker that's happening every single day and across a huge area. That is what the Brumbies are doing. Now, I've witnessed the Brumby Wars, but not just from the ecological perspective. I interviewed 60 people, just over.
Yep.
About 30 of each from each side, Matt.
Yep.
I sat with John Barilaro, the recently departed Deputy Premier of New South Wales, who drafted the first law in Australian history to protect a feral species in a national park, which goes exactly against what the 1974 National Park Act is there to do, to protect native wildlife. Barra's law completely undermines that, but it passed.
Yep.
I sat with him. I sat with Brumby advocates. I sat with Brumby rehomers. I sat with cattlemen. I walked with them. And then I walked with scientists, and I walked with bushwalkers. I just, and all sorts of people. I spoke to people all across the spectrum because I had a really clear objective in mind. The Brumby Wars is a culture war, Matt. It's a bitter, nasty war. It takes place on Facebook, and it takes place in real life in the towns around the mountains. There are instances of park rangers kids getting bashed by Brumby supporters kids. Like it's a bitter, nasty, and occasionally violent war. I'm
always looking for a middle ground somewhere, and because there always is a middle ground somewhere that doesn't always keep everyone happy. In fact, often doesn't keep very many people happy, but I'm really interested to see how you think we should solve this crisis. But before we get to that, can tell me a little bit more about what you've learned from the science. Like the cattlemen say that grazing in the high country reduces the severity of fires.
Yeah.
Is there anything in that?
No, that's the cattlemen don't say that. Only the dopey cattlemen say that. Only the stupid, ineducable cattlemen say that. And they put that into a neatly encapsulated phrase: grazing prevents blazing. There's this Facebook army of people who say that, and those people will tell you that tomato soup is chicken soup. Like it is completely scientifically wrong on every level. And the reason I pulled you up on the cattlemen side is because there are dozens of journals of old cattlemen who knew that cattle did bugger all to prevent the grazing, as the Brumbies do. Because the fire in Kosciuszko, it's so simple. It is carried not by grass, which only grows to ankle level in the snowgrass tufts, right?
Yeah.
It is carried by the heathy bushes that grow to waist and neck level, and by the lower canopy of the forest, right? So, and forests are always at their most flammable within about 5 to 15 years after a fire, when that lower canopy is going crazy because the upper canopy is compromised and can let all that low stuff grow. It's only when a fire is at its least a forest is at its least flammable straight after a fire, or about 80 years after a fire, because certainly in the high country anyway, because the lower canopy will have thinned out. Anyway, mate, long story short, grazing does not prevent blazing because it is not grass that carries the fire. End of section. It is so simple, and there, as I said, there are old cattlemen's journals that say that, and there are sort of grumpy cattlemen activists like Peter Cochrane out of Yayak, north of Anaminabie, who was the member for Monero before Barrow was back in the 90s, several terms before Barrow. He puts grazing prevents grazing out there, and it's bullshit. It's garbage. It's gobbledygook. It's childlike thinking. It's shameful misleading of the public. It is all of the above. And by the way, if grazing prevents blazing, okay, then we know that we've got more Brumbies in the high country than ever before, right? Especially leading up to the fires of 2000. How come we had the Black Summer fires if grazing prevents blazing? How come if we've got more Brumbies than we ever had before? And the other thing these idiots do is dispute the count. It's a tactic. They say, no, we don't have that many. It doesn't matter what the count is because we have more Brumbies than we ever have before. And you know that from walking the high country, and I know that from walking the high country. Parkies know that from working in the high country, and motorists know that from dodging them on the road in the high country. There is no doubt that we've got more Brumbies than we ever had before. And if we do, which we do, if they prevent blazing, did we have such blazing? So that ends that. But that's what the Brumby mythology is all about, a lot of myths. It goes back to Banjo Patterson. It goes back to Elaine Mitchell's Silver Brumby. The Brumby is a symbol of the high country in many people's minds. And that's understandable. Culturally, that is very understandable. But when the mythology spills over to scientific bullshit, it must be called out. And so that's what I've done in the Brumby Wars. I've interviewed 30 people on each side. If you love Brumbies, as one woman does, Jill Pickering, president of the Australian Brumby Alliance, because you were disabled, because you were born with polio, and because horses gave you freedom, and because you went on a legal horse trek through the high country of Victoria and saw wild Brumbies, and you had never seen wild Brumbies in your life. I mean, my point, Matt, is that if you have a reason that you love Brumbies, you love wild horses, you love the mythology of Patterson or of Elaine Mitchell and her Silver Brumby book. Good for you, and I recorded that in the book. I needed to explain that there are a lot of people out there who have an attachment to these animals, so they're not like other feral species. No one cares about pigs. No one cares about deer. Some deer hunters want to shoot them, but no one has an emotional bond to the animal and the stories and the, the human interaction that people have with horses. But if you started spouting pseudoscientific gobbledygook, I'll cut you off at that point. So in the Brumby Wars, I wanted to map out the whole landscape of this issue, Matt. And that's almost an unfashionable thing to do these days. And, when you think about it, the original project of journalism, because this is like a long-form piece of journalism with a few jokes cracked in there. But the original project of journalism is cover all sides of an issue, tell the full story. And I feel like we've almost forgotten to do that these days. I read essays on coal in Queensland, for example, and the scourge of it and the reef in trouble, but not a coal miner is interviewed. We all know that we need to end coal mining, but you can't write about these landscapes, about these places where these issues are being played out. You can write about it in general sense, and you don't have to interview a coal miner, But if you're going to write about the landscapes where it's being played out, you need to approach both sides and create a ground of shared humanity so that whatever we do going forward to try and solve the problem takes into account the other side. So that is why I wrote a book called The Brumby Wars. But I wanted to do this old-fashioned thing. I wanted to say, hey, Australia, we have this issue. You read about it in the paper from time to time. I want you to understand all the players on all sides. It was almost more like an academic work. I just need to map it out and go, this is what's going on. This is the history, the sociology, the personality, the ecology of this issue. And now we need to find a way forward. What is the way forward?
I would love to talk to you about the way forward, and we're nearly out of time. I would love to talk to you, to spend some time talking about Guy Fawkes National Park, what happened up there, how that's tainted the whole debate. So I guess the long and the short of that is that reducing Brumby numbers, wild horse numbers, is difficult and expensive. The problem is the longer we leave it, the more expensive and the more difficult it's going to become when you look at the numbers of wild horses in the national park now. You finish your book, The Brumby Wars, with a potential solution, and as I said, there's no solution is going to keep many people happy, but it seemed like a pretty good way forward. What do you reckon we should do about the wild horses in the Kosciuszko National Park?
Well, the first thing I think we should do is thin the herd, and that is going to happen. Barilaro's legislation did have provision for a plan of management. It's taken 3 years, but that plan of management has finally gone out for public submission, come back, been signed off. All that happened in the last couple of weeks. So they are going to thin the estimated 14,000 down to about 3,000. And I'll get to my solution in about 10 seconds, Matt, but I just want to say that 3,000 horses is still a lot. When rangers in Kosciuszko said, oh my God, we've got a Brumby problem, that was in the 1990s, and they said there are too many of these things now running around. They had probably about 2,000. So we've now declared that 1.5 times the number that was originally declared a problem is the number we're happy with. So, that's what people need to know. But at least it's better than the 14,000. Now, I also advocate for sanctuaries. I think there's a good model of a sanctuary in South Australia. There was a wild herd at a place called Coffin Bay at the bottom of the Eyre Peninsula. Coffin Bay Brumbies are valued by locals. It became national park. Someone bought a piece of land and said, "We'll bring the stock. Still got the genes of the old, genetic footprint of the old stock. Stick them on this bit of land. They're semi-wild. We feed them in a drought, but they're semi-wild. They run around this bit of land. We need sanctuaries, and we need them out of park. And we need them somewhere near the park so the landscape looks like Kosciuszko. So that people can go, I love my Brumbies in an alpine setting or a subalpine setting. I want to go to see them. We need to fence off a big bit of land and have viewing platforms and charge people to go and see them, because people have to put their money where their mouth is. Just as a skier needs to pay $30 to even drive through the park in winter for snow clearing, some sort of Brumby maintenance fee should be applied for people who want to go to these sanctuaries. And if the sanctuary fails, and after 5 years no one has gone to it, then they're abandoned, because the Brumby people are then shown only to be social media warriors and not actual people with a stake in the issue. So I would love to see a sanctuary set up as a trial, and if it works, keep it.
And reduce Brumby numbers in the rest of the park to zero, do you think? Or is that even possible?
No, because in accordance with the plan, by law, they are to be reduced to 3,000. So it is not, I think any ecologist would tell you that zero is a desirable number. I think a lot of park rangers would tell you that, but as well, off the record. But no, I think some should be kept, because there are some people who cherish these animals. And, a national park is a compromised space. Even though it exists as a space to maintain as much of pre-colonial Australia as we can, there are those with post-colonial visions of this country. And that includes horses to some. And tragically, you might say, national parks are compromised anyway, Matt. We have ski resorts in national parks. Kosciuszko should be a World Heritage Area. That's how magnificent it is. You don't qualify for being a World Heritage Area if you've got ski resorts in you. It is already a compromised landscape. So set aside, for the time being at least, tiny areas where Brumbies can run. I'm not a fan of the plan as it currently stands, reducing it to 3,000, which means 32%, or roughly a third of the park, is to be horse country. So that's disgusting, in my opinion. It should be 3%, not 32%. I said as much in my public submission, and like everyone else who said as much, it was ignored. But that's all right. We're moving towards compromise. We're going to lose 11,000 horses, and we have to, because it's a horse paddock up there at the moment, and it has to be a national park again. And 3,000 is a starting point for that. Yep.
Anthony, absolutely fantastic to talk to you this morning. Thanks for your time. I'd love you to come and visit us down here on the South Coast. Come and stay, and we could do a book launch.
Thank you for having me on, and I do hope to see you in person soon.